What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today I'm bringing to you the long-awaited part 2 of my suspension tuning guide. This time we'll be covering anti-roll bars, camber, and toe. Apologies for this taking so long, but between the other videos I had in the pipeline and real life things getting in the way, this took longer than I hoped, but it's finally here, so thank you all for being patient. As always, if you like my tuning guides, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Without further ado, let's get started. Like in the previous guides, I'll be discussing a bit of theory behind these settings so you can understand exactly what they're doing. We don't really need any equations or anything like that this time, but visualizing what's going on with the suspension will help you make the appropriate changes to your setup when something isn't to your liking. First, I'm going to talk about camber. Camber is the angle of tilt your tires have with respect to the ground. If you're looking at a car from the front or back, then negative camber, which is the most common configuration and our only option in GT7, will tilt the tires inward towards the center of the car, and the tires will be resting more on the inside edge. Positive camber will tilt them outwards, and the tires lean more on the outside edge. You may be wondering why you'd want your tires to have any negative camber at all. When going along a circular path, the acceleration keeping you on that path is directed towards the center of the circle. In a rotating frame of reference, there's an equivalent force pointing to the outside of the circle to balance that force out, and any object on that path experiences that force. Any corner can be defined as a sum of different circular paths, so the reaction force is always directed towards the outside of the car. You've probably experienced this when going quickly through a traffic intersection. Your body always leans opposite to the direction you're turning. The tires also experience this force, which results in tire lean. If the tires were flat before a corner, you'd be putting excess force on the outside of the tire during the corner, and you wouldn't be achieving optimal grip. By putting some negative camber in the setup, when you go through a corner, the camber will counteract the tire lean, and your contact patch will be maximized. These are some images from the Beyond the Apex document in the game that illustrate this. This effect will never be perfect for every corner on a track, so finding the right balance is important. You want enough camber for high load corners, but you also don't want too much that you sacrifice grip elsewhere, particularly with straight line stability and braking. You'll also want to consider the weight of the vehicle you're driving. More weight results in more roll, so you might find yourself needing more camber in heavier road cars, whereas lighter cars in a similar performance bracket might run lower camber. In addition to vehicle weight, downforce is another setting you'll have to consider when setting camber, but I'll cover the relationship there in more detail in a future video. In short, with more downforce, you'll have more cornering force, which means more tire lean with all else equal, so you should run more camber in theory. That being said, it seems like downforce can make up for small issues caused by a lack of camber, so you may be able to get away with less camber without seeing too many problems. As always, this is something that needs to be tested by trial and error when tuning in Gran Turismo 7. Normally, you set your camber based on tire temperature readings. If the outside of the tire is much hotter than the inside, then you need more negative camber, and if the inside is much hotter, then you need less camber. These don't need to be exact though. Keeping the inside 5 to 10 degrees hotter than the outside is pretty common. Temperatures can also help identify tire wear issues, as too much or too little camber will wear the tires quicker. Going on a slight tangent with tire temperatures, if both the inside and outside are too hot, you need more pressure, and if the middle is too hot, then you need less pressure. But this doesn't apply in GT7 since we can't adjust it. Unfortunately, we're missing both tire pressure and temperature readings, so as with many other settings in the game, we have to measure changes by how they feel, since that's all we have. The same applies with tire wear. I haven't seen much of a difference here in GT7 with camber, but if you use extremely high camber settings, then I would guess you might see worse tire wear. One more thing to keep in mind with camber is that you'll want to go lower on the driven wheels compared to the non-driven ones. This is because the tire begins to roll back towards its natural position as you start to exit a corner, and if you have too much camber, you won't have the maximum contact patch possible for putting down power. We'll go over some examples of that with different drivetrain configurations in a little bit. Now let's cover toe. Toe is a bit easier to understand than camber, but it's also a finer adjustment to a setup rather than a core component of it. When looking at a car from the top down, toe is defined as how much the wheels are pointed inward or outward. These settings are known as toe in and toe out respectively. If you imagine standing pigeon-toed or duck-footed, that's essentially what the tires are doing with toe in or toe out settings. By setting toe out, you make the car tend towards oversteer, and toe in makes it tend toward understeer. This is because the tires are pointed outward with toe out, which makes the car want to turn in more initially and utilize the inside tire more. Conversely, toe in resists turn in because they're pointed inward, which can give you stability while cornering. Typically, you'll want to go with toe out on the front and toe in on the rear if you choose to use it at all. This makes it so you can get a bit more response on turn in, and then you have rear end stability for exits. You can also try some toe in on the front if you're getting too much turn in on entry, but I would not recommend toe out on the rear in any case. This will cause instability all around, especially on throttle, and it won't really help you elsewhere. Keep in mind that toe settings point the tires at a slightly different angle than their direction of travel, and dragging the tires along like that will increase tire heat and wear. Toe adjustments are usually pretty small, so this effect usually isn't something to worry about, but it's one reason not to get carried away with your toe adjustments. Toe adjustments can really help if you find that your setup is pretty good, but it's just missing a little something. If you've reached the point where the other settings seem pretty good, but the car needs a bit more response or just a bit more stability, making those corresponding toe changes can help there. I typically keep my toe at 0 unless I've exhausted all my other options, and it's very rare to have a setup that can't be improved elsewhere, but those cases do come up and toe comes in handy there. So that's all that needs to be discussed about toe, so let's move on to anti-roll bars. These do exactly what their name says. They prevent the front or rear of the car body from rolling. They also adjust the amount of load distributed to each end of the car, so the roll bars will be one of the biggest knobs that you can turn for quick handling changes. They also act like a second spring during cornering. That is, you can use them to increase your effective stiffness at the wheel during cornering without having to increase natural frequencies. This allows you to keep the braking and acceleration grip you desire while also making stiffness adjustments in the corners. Since anti-roll bars come into play with body roll, let's define that first. In a corner, rolling is described by the inside of the car lifting in relation to the outside. This happens because of the force direction that I mentioned earlier along a circular path. Most of the force goes to the outside of the car, and there's not as much force on the inside, so the car wants to rotate towards the outside. By preventing this from happening, you can use more grip from the inside tires and balance the load more evenly, so you get more cornering force overall. You're putting more load on the outside tires with stiff roll bars, so the tire loads can become imbalanced, but it's important to keep body roll in check so that the tire can consistently keep its contact patch maximized. There's no point in loading a tire more when it's already grip limited by a smaller contact patch. It's also important to note that cornering force doesn't increase linearly with tire load. Rather, there are diminishing returns in cornering force as load increases. We can see this on the graph shown in Beyond the Apex. A and B would have more overall grip than A' and B'. This is because if you move A's load down to A', you lose cornering force at a rate that's fairly close to linear, but when you add that lost load to B to move it towards B', there's only a small increase in cornering force, so the total cornering force from both tires with A' and B' is lower. To put it simply, stiffer roll bars help with controlling roll and distributing load on the tires. This can be good when a car tends to roll before the tire reaches peak lateral grip, but if you go too far, you'll be asking too much of the tires and you'll start to slide because of how stiff the suspension is at the wheel. It's also possible that the inside tire starts to lift off the ground if your roll bars are too stiff. I haven't seen this in GT7, but it's something to keep in mind. Since anti-roll bars affect the roll stiffness of the car, your camber settings may change depending on how stiff or soft you set them. With stiff roll bars, you'll run a bit lower camber, and you might find your setup needing some more camber if you have to use softer roll bar settings. The same goes for natural frequency and downforce to a certain degree in regards to camber, but you'll see this effect more with the roll bars. As for making setup changes, the roll bars are fairly simple. Stiff all around usually works on GT7, but dial it back a bit if the car is sliding too much mid-corner or it just feels too stiff. Also, if you have softer natural frequencies, it's good practice to have stiffer roll bars so you have appropriate roll stiffness during cornering. As far as balancing oversteer and understeer, if you need more rotation, you soften the front or stiffen the rear. And if you need more stability, you do the opposite. I tend to make front bar adjustments for off-throttle response and rear bar adjustments for on-throttle, but either of those are fair game when looking out for a particular change in handling behavior. Alright, that's enough about theory, so now let's look at how everything works in the game. To start, we'll check camber first, and I'll be using the Super Group 4 car on NerbGP again as a test bed. I really like NERB GP for testing because it has a little bit of everything. Got hard and soft braking zones, hairpin, sweepers, varying degrees of camber, and so on. This time I'm going to start with a default setup since my setups usually don't have many settings in the middle, and I'd like to have some range of adjustment to show the differences. As I make changes to the setup, I'll keep what settings I find best and then carry those over when changing the next part of the setup. Before I do that, I'm going to set a lap with the default setup to set a baseline. Now that we have a baseline, I'm going to make some camber changes. The stock values actually felt alright, but let's see how the car behaves when we go to either extreme. First, we'll try adding more camber and see if that helps with cornering speed. These values are a little high for a car like this, but they're not unheard of in real life, so let's give them a try. Going into turn 1, I brake at about the same time, but the baseline ghost outbrakes me, which tells me I've already gone too far with the camber. It's not really helping me in corners either. There's not enough force or roll to where that amount of camber is required, so I'm actually making the contact patch smaller than optimal by rolling the tires too far inside. If you see issues like this, your camber might be too high, so try dropping it. More camber didn't work, so let's try going the other way. This time, I'm going to the other extreme and setting this to 0. The game says the car pulls more rotational G this way, but that's not always the case. I've linked a video in the description explaining this. However, going to extremes is useful in identifying how the changes affect handling, and we can find a sweet spot quickly by doing this. Let's see how 0 camber compares to the baseline. So as I'm driving through the first sector, this isn't nearly as bad as too much camber, but it's still not ideal. Again, the contact patches of the tires aren't maximized here, but this time it's because the tires are rolling over past the optimal point. So the outside is being worked too hard, whereas the inside isn't being used as much as it could be. This isn't terribly detrimental to your pace in GT7, but it still loses you a bit of time. If you're looking to change camber from the default setup, I would almost always recommend going lower, not higher. As we saw here, getting it wrong and going too low isn't the end of the world, but going too high can really have an adverse effect on your setup. So if you're going to make changes, try going towards the lower end of camber. After doing some more trial and error testing, These are the camber values that I like the best. These may differ slightly from driver to driver based on how your driving style induces body roll, but there's a range of values that will be fastest regardless of driving style. Notice I also dropped the rear slightly compared to the front. This car is rear wheel drive, so I wanted slightly less camber on those driven wheels. The stock camber felt a bit vague and wandered around a bit, and these changes made the car easier to read during cornering. I think the ultimate pace of both settings is pretty similar, but the settings I've chosen here get there more consistently. We've seen that 3 degrees and below works fine for this car, but let's see what happens when the driven wheels have too much camber. I took my preferred settings and then added an extra degree of camber to the rear, so let's see how this compares. As expected, the car is a bit more unstable on the throttle, and while it has similar potential, reaching that potential is more difficult, and there's less room for error if you overdo it, so it's easier to get on throttle oversteer with settings like this. Similarly, in front wheel drive, the front wheels need less camber than the rear, and you'll understeer on throttle if you have too much. In four wheel drive, you can set them roughly equal, but I still go slightly lower on the rear because I tend to tune my four wheel drive cars very loose. That way, they behave more like rear wheel drive cars, but with the added benefit of four wheel drive exit traction. Now that we have a basic understanding of where our camber should be, let's move on to roll bars. I'm going to show max and min roll bar settings all around to demonstrate body roll versus slide, and then I'll max and min each end so you can see how that contributes to oversteer and understeer. The stock roll bars are in the middle at 5 and 5, so these extreme tests will help identify how the car responds, and then we can make smaller changes accordingly. For the first test, I'll start with fully stiff roll bars. As we go through the first sector, it's actually not too bad. A lot of cars actually work with very stiff roll bars, so it's good to try this just to check. However, as I try pushing the car harder through this sector, it can't quite handle the load transfer and it starts to slide out a bit. It also feels a bit stiffer than I'd like, but I feel that this would be very nice to drive if a bit of stiffness was removed. Now we'll try full soft. This is a very rare setup option, and you'll never see it on a high-end race car. The body roll will make cornering very sloppy, and the car will lose control much easier. On this test lap, I'm doing some small weaves down the straight just so you can physically see the body roll with very soft roll bars. Throughout this sector, the car is just a mess. Understeer on entry, oversteer on exit, and a lack of stability everywhere. I definitely don't want the car to go in this direction with the setup, so I don't think I'll be going any softer on the roll bars. Now we have an idea of how roll bar stiffness affects handling, but now I'm going to set the front and rear to opposite extremes to see how the car responds. With a fully stiff front and a fully soft rear, I expect a lot of understeer, so let's see what happens. As expected, there's some understeer all around, but it's not as bad as I thought it would be. I'm also getting decent rear end grip on exit, but the car is just overall less responsive than I'd like, and it really starts to suffer more in high speed corners. In the middle sector, it gets to the point where I push the car so hard trying to get it to turn that I start sliding, and I'd rather just soften the front or stiffen the rear at that point. That being said, I've seen a lot of rear wheel drive setups have a slightly stiffer front bar than rear, so if you're hunting for rear grip, then that's always a valid option. Even in iRacing, I've seen setups that disconnect the rear bar entirely, So don't rule this out if you're really looking for rear grip and you don't know what else to change. Now we'll do the opposite of the previous test. This time the rear is fully stiff and the front is fully soft. I expect a lot of oversteer and instability here, so let's see if that's the case. We have expected behavior here yet again, but it's just like the previous test, where it's not as bad as I thought it would be. It's still pretty bad though, don't get me wrong. Overall, the car is very snappy, and while it feels faster on occasion, keeping it balanced throughout every phase of the corner is very difficult, and the rear end just gets out from under me way too easily. After testing both extremes, I'm actually pretty satisfied with the balance, so I just raised the stiffness on both ends a little bit. This tamed a bit of the body roll the stock setup had, and these settings are also directionally correct with lowering camber. Depending on the track, I might decide to raise or lower the front bar one click more, but I like the balance on NERB GP with these settings. Finally, I'm going to cover toe. As stated before, this is more of a finishing touch rather than a core component of your setup. I've heard a few people a lot smarter than me with vehicle dynamics say that if you think you need toe out, you just need to turn in earlier. And while I don't agree with that 100%, I definitely get the idea behind that. First, I'll show what additional toe out looks like at the front. This is a common adjustment to make when you need a bit more initial turn in. It's usually not necessary, but it can help get that last bit of time out of your setup, especially in front wheel drive cars. Just keep in mind that you don't want to go crazy with toe. If you think you need more than half a degree of toe to fix your setup, your problem most likely lies elsewhere. Also, if your setup is a bit sketchy on entry, particularly in faster corners, you can go with toe in instead to increase stability. So comparing this front toe adjustment to the Ghost, there's really not much of a difference, but in turn 2 it tends to pull itself back in as I go through the corner, which can be helpful if the car doesn't want to stick to the line as closely as you'd like. However, this toe setting is scrubbing off a bit more speed to accomplish this, and I'm already satisfied with how I can place the car on the line here, so I'll opt out of making this change. I'm also satisfied with the stability I have here. I don't need any more, so I won't bother with toe in on the front either. Now we'll look at toe in on the rear. As stated before, toe out is typically a no-no on the rear, but it's a game after all, so it might work in some applications. I'll leave that up to you guys to test. As for toe in, this will help with exit stability and result in less of a tendency to slide on throttle. Just like the front, it's possible to restrict the rear too much, so the same rule goes here. If you need more than half a degree of toe in, your problem probably lies elsewhere. Comparing this change again to the Ghost, it's actually not bad at all. Some even might prefer this to the stock toe. The stability coming out of corners is improved slightly, but the faster corners have a bit too much stability for my liking, so the rear end doesn't slip quite enough to get through the corners as fast as I would like. For my personal setup, I would end up either running stock toe or just zero it out altogether. But there are clearly cases where toe in can help you, so try it out and use it if you find it to be better. Well, that was another lengthy guide, but I hope that clarifies how these settings work and how you can change them to improve your setups. I go into the theory so you can visualize what each setting does, and as you get more familiar with the tuning options, you'll be able to use that theory to know what to change when a problem comes up, instead of chasing your tail or creating even more problems. If that doesn't quite do it for you, or if you're just here to see the immediate results in the game, that's fine too, and I hope these demonstrations still helped you out. But that's all I've got for this time, guys. Again, sorry this one took so long to get out there. I've been super busy and this took a lot of time to get everything right, so I hope this is what everyone's looking for. If you have any further questions or you want to add on to the information I covered here, please post those in the comments below. My next guide will most likely cover differential settings. Hopefully that won't take as long as this one, but I plan to cover that in similar detail so you guys have access to as much information as possible. But until then, thanks for watching this guide and I will catch you in the next one.